The old piano in the corner of the Thornfield Conservatory's main hall had been Thomas Webb's secret friend for nearly 2 years now. As the evening cleaning shift ended and the building emptied of its proper occupants, the students with their expensive clothes and confident walks, Thomas would take out his ring of janitor's keys and lock the main doors. Then, in the quiet of the empty building, he would walk to that corner and uncover the grand piano that cost more than he would make in 5 years. The first time had been an accident. He had been dusting the keys, careful not to press down too hard when his finger slipped and a clear note rang out. The sound hung in the air of the empty hall, and something inside Thomas had shifted. That night he had pressed another key, then another, testing how they sounded together. By the end of the week, he was staying an extra hour after his shift, playing broken melodies he remembered from childhood. Tonight, the moon shone through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Thomas set his mop and bucket aside, washed his hands thoroughly in the bathroom, and dried them carefully before approaching the piano. His work uniform, gray pants and a button-up shirt with the conservatory logo, was not what most pianists wore when they sat at this instrument. But in the empty hall, there was no one to judge. "Just me and you tonight," he whispered to the piano as he pulled out the bench. Thomas had grown up in Milltown, the factory district across the river. His father had worked the assembly line at the car parts factory until his back gave out. His mother cleaned houses for the wealthy families on the north side. Neither of them had ever imagined their son would develop a love for classical music. It wasn't something people from their neighborhood were supposed to care about. But when Thomas was 8, a teacher had played a recording of Beethoven during class, and something had clicked inside him. The way the notes talked to each other, the story they told without words, it made sense to him in a way that nothing else did. After school, he would hum the melodies while helping his mother fold laundry, trying to remember every note. For his 10th birthday, his parents had scraped together enough money to buy a used electronic keyboard from a pawn shop. It wasn't a real piano, just 5 octaves with plastic keys that didn't have the right weight to them, but Thomas had treated it like treasure. He taught himself to play by ear, picking out tunes from the radio and eventually trying to recreate the classical pieces he heard at school. The keyboard had died after 3 years, its circuits finally giving up. By then Thomas was in middle school, where loving classical music made him different in ways that weren't good. He kept his passion secret, playing on the school's out-of-tune upright during lunch when the music room was empty. Now, at 26, Thomas settled onto the bench in the conservatory hall, his back straight, his shoulders relaxed the way he'd seen the students sit during practice. His hands hovered over the keys for a moment, work-worn hands with calluses and a small scar across his right palm from when he'd cut himself fixing a broken window last winter. He began to play. The piece started soft, a melody that had been building in his mind for weeks now. Thomas didn't know how to write music on paper, had never learned to read notes properly, but the music lived in his head, complete and waiting. His fingers found the keys without hesitation, building the gentle introduction into something more complex. The left hand began a pattern that pulsed like a heartbeat, while his right hand wove a story above it. As he played, Thomas forgot about being a janitor, forgot about the apartment with the leaky faucet where he lived alone, forgot about the way the conservatory students looked through him as if he were part of the furniture. Here, with just the moonlight and the music, he was simply a musician speaking the truth as he understood it. The piece grew, taking on a life of its own. Thomas added elements he hadn't planned, a thundering bass section that made him think of his father's factory, a delicate high passage that reminded him of his mother humming while she worked. The music swelled and receded like the river that divided the city, the one he crossed every morning on his bike to get to work. An hour passed without Thomas noticing. His uniform shirt had dark patches of sweat at the back and his fingers ached pleasantly. As the final notes faded into the empty hall, he sat still, not wanting to break the spell. A small sound behind him made him jump. "I didn't mean to startle you," said a voice. "I forgot my scarf and came back to get it." Thomas turned to see one of the cleaning staff supervisors, Rose Chen, standing in the doorway. How long had she been there? Heat rushed to his face as he stood up quickly, nearly knocking over the bench. "I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't." "That was beautiful," Rose said, stepping into the room. "I had no idea you could play like that." Thomas looked down at his shoes. "I was just fooling around." I'll lock up now. Thomas, that wasn't fooling around. She walked closer, her keys jingling at her hip. That was, well, I don't know much about classical music, but it sounded professional to me. He shook his head. I never had lessons or anything. It's just something I do sometimes. Rose was quiet for a moment, studying him with new eyes. Have you ever played for anyone else? Besides me accidentally hearing you just now? No, Thomas said. The thought made his stomach tighten. It's just for me. Rose nodded slowly, then seemed to make a decision. Did you know about the spring showcase next month? The one where Maestro Reinhardt will be attending? Everyone at the conservatory knew about it. The famous conductor Nikolai Reinhardt was coming to scout for new talent for his orchestra. Students had been practicing frantically for months, hoping to catch his attention. I've heard about it, Thomas said carefully. There's an open audition portion, Rose said. Anyone can sign up, even people who don't attend the conservatory. Thomas laughed, a short, uncomfortable sound. Right. I'm sure they'd love to hear the janitor play. Rose didn't laugh back. I think they would, actually, especially if you played what I just heard. Thomas covered the piano carefully, smoothing the cloth over the polished surface. People like me don't belong on that stage, Rose. What does that mean, people like you? He gestured to his uniform, to his hands. I didn't go to music school. I can't even read sheet music properly. The students here have been training since they were kids. And yet what I just heard was more moving than most of the practicing I hear during my shifts, Rose said. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket and set it on top of the covered piano. This is the sign-up sheet. Just think about it. After she left, Thomas stared at the paper for a long time before tucking it into his pocket. He finished his closing routine, checking all the doors and windows, turning off the lights. As he walked to the bike rack outside, the night air cool on his face, he couldn't stop thinking about Rose's words. People from Milltown didn't become concert pianists. They worked in factories or in service jobs, or if they were lucky, they got office work across the river. They didn't play at showcases where famous conductors might hear them. And yet, as Thomas unlocked his bike and began the long ride home, the thought took root. What if he did sign up? What was the worst that could happen? The worst would be humiliation, of course. The wealthy students laughing at his audacity. The teachers raising their eyebrows at the janitor who thought he belonged on their stage. But the best that could happen? Thomas wasn't sure he could even imagine it. His tiny apartment was dark when he arrived. He heated up leftover soup on the stove and ate standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. On his side of the river, the street lamps were dimmer, spaced farther apart. Across the water, the conservatory district glowed bright against the night sky. Thomas pulled the sign-up sheet from his pocket and spread it flat on his kitchen counter. The showcase was 3 weeks away. He had 3 weeks to decide if he was brave enough or foolish enough to cross a different kind of river. For 2 weeks, Thomas carried the sign-up sheet in his pocket, taking it out during lunch breaks and late at night in his apartment. The paper grew soft at the creases, smudged from his fingers. Each time he unfolded it, he came close to filling in his name, but something always stopped him. You're being ridiculous, he told himself one evening, as he stirred a pot of pasta on his small stove. They'll laugh you right off the stage. And yet, the next morning, he found himself lingering outside the administration office where the sign-up sheet needed to be turned in. He watched as a young woman in designer clothes confidently handed in her form, chatting easily with the secretary about which piece she would perform. Her hands were smooth, her nails perfectly shaped. Thomas looked down at his own hands, rough from work, with a fresh cut on his thumb from fixing a door hinge yesterday. He shoved the paper back in his pocket and hurried away to finish his morning rounds. That night, Thomas stayed later than usual at the piano. He played the piece he'd been developing, the one that had come to him in fragments over months. It had never been written down, existed only in his mind and fingers, but it felt more complete with each practice. Tonight he added a new section, something that spoke of longing and fear, of standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down. When he finished playing, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then, with sudden decision, he pulled out the wrinkled form and a pencil from his work cart. Before he could change his mind, he printed his name, Thomas Webb, and in the space for piece to be performed, he wrote, Original Composition. The next morning, he handed in the form before his shift started. The secretary looked surprised to see the janitor at her desk but took the paper without comment. As Thomas walked away, his heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. "I did it," he whispered to himself, both terrified and strangely light, as if he might float away. The days leading up to the showcase crawled by. Thomas cleaned the same classrooms, fixed the same recurring problems, and nodded politely when students or teachers passed. None of them knew what he had done, what was coming. At night, he practiced with new intensity, refining the piece, making small changes, sometimes losing himself so completely in the music that he jumped when the security alarm beeped its hourly check. 3 days before the showcase, Thomas was mopping the hallway outside practice room C when he overheard 2 students talking inside. "Have you seen the list for the showcase?" The janitor signed up. The voice was male, amused. "You're kidding." "Which one?" A female voice answered. "The quiet one, always cleaning the main hall." "What's his name?" "Tom or something." "Thomas," the girl corrected. "That's weird. What's he going to play? The Mop Symphony?" They both laughed, and Thomas felt his face burn. He moved further down the hall, out of earshot, his hands tight on the mop handle. That night, he almost didn't go to the piano. What was he thinking? These people had been training since childhood. They had teachers and theory and proper techniques. They could read music, write it down, speak the language of classical composition. He was just a guy who liked to press keys and see what happened. But something pulled him back to the grand piano in the corner. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the memory of his mother saying, "Don't let them tell you what you can't do, Tommy." Whatever it was, he sat down and played with a new fire in his fingers. The night of the showcase arrived cold and clear, with stars visible despite the city lights. Thomas finished his shift early, then went to the employee bathroom where he had stashed a change of clothes. He'd spent nearly a week's pay on the outfit, a simple black button-up shirt and dark gray pants that weren't fancy, but were clean and new. He'd even bought a tie, dark blue, which he now struggled to knot correctly. After 3 attempts, he got the tie looking passable. He splashed water on his face and combed his hair, studying his reflection. The man in the mirror looked both like himself and like a stranger, someone who might belong on a stage. "Just play like you do when no one's listening," he told his reflection. "That's all you can do." The main hall was transformed for the evening. Rows of chairs faced the stage where the grand piano, not the one Thomas usually played, but an even more impressive instrument, gleamed under the lights. Already people in formal wear were finding their seats, programs in hand. Thomas slipped in through a side door, his heart racing when he saw how many people had come. Near the front, a cluster of important-looking people were being shown to reserved seats. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and an air of absolute authority, could only be Maestro Reinhardt. Thomas had seen his photo in the conservatory's brochure. In person, he looked even more intimidating. Thomas found a seat in the back corner and studied his program. He was last on the list, number 17. He would have to sit through 16 other performances before his turn came. The showcase began with a speech from the conservatory's director, welcoming everyone and especially Maestro Reinhardt. The famous conductor nodded graciously to the applause. Then the performances began. One by one, students took the stage. Some played piano, others violin or cello. A young man sang an aria that made the hair on Thomas's arms stand up. Each performer was talented, polished, confident. They bowed with practiced grace, accepting applause as if it were natural to them. As number 16 finished, a girl playing a complex piano piece that made Thomas's palms sweat with its difficulty. He felt a tap on his shoulder. Rose Chen, the supervisor who had heard him playing that night, slid into the empty seat beside him. "You really signed up?" she whispered, smiling. Thomas nodded, too nervous to speak. "Good. They need to hear what you can do." She squeezed his arm briefly. "I'll be right here." The director returned to the stage. "Our final performer tonight is Thomas Webb playing an original composition." A murmur went through the audience. Thomas stood on legs that felt disconnected from his body. As he walked toward the stage, he heard whispers. "Isn't that the janitor? What's he doing here? This should be interesting." He felt every eye on him as he climbed the 3 steps to the stage. The director gave him a puzzled look but gestured to the piano. Thomas approached it slowly, aware of his tie feeling suddenly too tight. He sat down on the bench, adjusting it slightly. From the audience came a snicker, then another. Someone whispered loudly enough to be heard, "Does he even know which end to play?" More laughter followed, spreading through the hall. Thomas looked up and accidentally caught Maestro Reinhardt's eye. The conductor made a small dismissive gesture with his hand and began to turn away, clearly expecting nothing worth his attention. The laughter grew. Thomas looked down at the keys, his mind suddenly blank. What was he doing here? This wasn't his world. These weren't his people. He didn't belong on this stage with his calloused hands and his unwritten music. Then in the silence of his panic, he heard his mother's voice again. "Don't let them tell you what you can't do." Thomas closed his eyes, shutting out the audience, the laughter, the judgmental stares. He placed his hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes were quiet, almost hesitant, just like the first time he'd touched a piano. But as his fingers remembered their purpose, the music grew stronger. The piece opened like a flower, revealing layers that even Thomas hadn't fully understood until this moment. It was everything he'd practiced, but somehow more, as if the pressure of the audience, the laughter still echoing, had distilled his music into something purer. He forgot where he was, forgot the stares and the whispers. There was only the music now, flowing from some deep place inside him out through his fingers. The melody spoke of work and dreams, of standing outside looking in, of finding beauty in unexpected places. His left hand built a foundation while his right told a story. His story. Thomas didn't notice when the laughter stopped. Didn't see the expressions changing from mockery to surprise, then to wonder. Didn't notice Maestro Reinhardt slowly turning back toward the stage, his eyebrows lifting, then drawing together in concentration. All Thomas knew was the music, carrying him away from this room, this moment of judgment, into a place where only the truth of sound existed. And in that place he was free. The laughter died away like morning mist under a rising sun. As Thomas played, the room fell so quiet that the soft pedal movements of the piano could be heard in the back row. His music filled the space, touching something in the listeners that went beyond technical skill or proper training. In the third row, a young violinist who had performed earlier leaned forward, her eyes wide. She had spent 12 years perfecting her technique, had won competitions across the country, but she had never played anything that felt this honest. Beside her, her teacher, who had criticized her just yesterday for lacking emotional depth, was sitting absolutely still, lips slightly parted in surprise. Thomas was unaware of all of this. His focus had narrowed to just his hands and the keys, to the music flowing from him. The piece moved into its middle section, where the melody became more complex. His left hand created a pattern like gentle waves, while his right hand built a soaring line above it. If anyone had asked, he couldn't have explained the music theory behind what he was doing. He only knew that this combination of notes expressed exactly what he felt. The struggle and the beauty of his ordinary life, transformed. Maestro Reinhardt had been to hundreds of performances. He had heard the most talented young musicians in the world, had conducted orchestras in the finest concert halls across Europe and America. He prided himself on his ability to spot true talent beneath the polish of training, but never in his 40-year career had he been so completely taken by surprise. When the janitor had walked onto the stage, Reinhardt had nearly left. The showcase had already run long, and he had heard enough technically proficient but uninspiring performances for one evening. The only reason he had stayed was out of politeness to his hosts. Now he found himself gripping the armrests of his chair, leaning forward like a man trying to get closer to a fire on a cold night. The janitor, Thomas was it, was playing something Reinhardt had never heard before. It wasn't any known classical piece, that much was certain, and yet it had elements that reminded him of Bach's emotional clarity, Chopin's expressiveness, even hints of modern composers like Glass in its rhythmic patterns. Most striking was the raw emotion pouring through the music. It wasn't polished or perfect. There were moments where a classically trained ear could detect small technical flaws, but those imperfections somehow made it more powerful, more human. This wasn't music created to impress judges or win competitions. This was music born from genuine feeling. As Thomas moved into the final section of his piece, the tempo increased slightly. His hands moved with certainty now, building toward something that even he hadn't fully heard until this moment. The music spoke of transformation, of stepping through a doorway into light after standing too long in shadow. In the back row, Rose Chen wiped a tear from her cheek. She had known Thomas had talent, had sensed something special that night when she accidentally heard him play. But this was beyond anything she had imagined. She watched the backs of the well-dressed audience members, saw how they had gone from dismissive to transfixed, and felt a fierce pride for the quiet janitor, who had found the courage to take this risk. As the piece approached its conclusion, Thomas allowed the music to soften, returning to elements of the opening theme but transformed. Like a person who has gone on a journey and returned changed. The final notes were played so gently they seemed to float in the air, lingering after his fingers had left the keys. Then, silence. Thomas sat still for a moment, his eyes closed, his body gradually becoming aware again of where he was, of what he had just done. The silence stretched for several heartbeats, then came the applause. It started with one person, the young violinist in the third row, and spread like wildfire. People were standing, clapping with genuine enthusiasm rather than the polite appreciation they had shown the other performers. Someone called out "Bravo" from the back, and others joined in. Thomas opened his eyes, blinking in surprise at the reaction. He stood awkwardly, not knowing the proper way to bow or acknowledge applause. He gave a small nod, his face flushed with emotion and embarrassment. As he turned to leave the stage, he saw Maestro Reinhardt rise from his seat and move toward the steps. Thomas froze, uncertain what to do. The famous conductor was approaching him with an intense expression that Thomas couldn't read. The applause continued as Reinhardt climbed the steps to the stage. He was tall and imposing up close, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through Thomas. The conductor extended his hand, and Thomas, after a moment's hesitation, shook it. "Young man," Reinhardt said, his voice carrying easily despite the continuing applause. "Where did you study?" The audience quieted, eager to hear the exchange. Thomas swallowed hard. "I didn't, sir," he said, his voice smaller than he would have liked. "I mean, I never had formal lessons." Reinhardt's eyebrows rose. "And that piece? Who composed it?" Thomas hesitated again. "I did, sir. It's not written down or anything. It's just something I've been working on." A murmur went through the crowd. The conservatory's director had joined them on stage now, looking back and forth between Thomas and Reinhardt with a mixture of confusion and growing excitement. "Not written down," Reinhardt repeated, as if the concept was difficult to grasp. "You play entirely by ear?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, sir." The conductor turned to face the audience, his hand still gripping Thomas's shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen, I came here tonight hoping to find talent worth developing. I believe I have found something even more rare, a natural musician with a genuine voice." He turned back to Thomas. "That piece tells a story. Your story, I think. I would very much like to hear it again and perhaps help you develop it further." Thomas felt as if he might be dreaming. "You want to hear it again?" "I do," Reinhardt said. "And I think we need to get it properly transcribed. Music like that shouldn't exist only in one person's mind. It deserves to be shared." The conservatory director stepped forward, suddenly all smiles. "Maestro, perhaps we could use one of our studios tomorrow. I'm sure we can arrange for Thomas to have some time off from his duties." Reinhardt nodded. "That would be acceptable." He turned back to Thomas. "Tomorrow morning, then? 10 o'clock? Thomas found himself nodding, still not quite believing what was happening. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." As he left the stage, the applause started again. Thomas walked down the aisle in a daze, aware of people reaching out to touch his arm to congratulate him. Faces that had never noticed him before were now smiling at him, nodding with respect. Rose met him at the back of the hall, her eyes bright with tears. "I knew it," she said, hugging him briefly. "I knew you were something special." Thomas couldn't find words to reply. His emotions were too jumbled, pride and disbelief and lingering traces of the fear he had felt walking onto that stage. The reception after the showcase was held in the conservatory's elegant lobby. Thomas had cleaned that lobby hundreds of times but had never been a guest there. Now people surrounded him, asking questions, offering congratulations. Students who had previously looked through him now wanted to know how long he had been playing, how he had developed his style. "I just play what I hear in my head," he told them, uncomfortable with the attention but trying his best to answer politely. "I don't really know how to explain it better than that." Across the room, he saw Maestro Reinhardt in conversation with several important-looking people, including the conservatory's director. They kept glancing his way, and Thomas had the distinct feeling they were discussing him. A server passed with a tray of champagne glasses. Thomas took one, needing something to do with his hands. The server, a man he knew from the catering company that handled conservatory events, gave him a surprised look and then a small nod of recognition. It was the look of one worker acknowledging another who had somehow crossed an invisible line. Thomas sipped the champagne, the bubbles unfamiliar on his tongue. Just this morning he had been mopping this very floor. Now he was standing on it in clean clothes, holding a champagne glass, being treated like a guest. It didn't feel real. He was about to step outside for some air when the conservatory director approached, Maestro Reinhardt at his side. "Thomas," the director said warmly, as if they were old friends. "Maestro Reinhardt has a proposal for you. I think you'll find it quite exciting." Thomas looked between them, waiting. Reinhardt spoke directly, his accent more noticeable up close. "Young man, talent like yours shouldn't be sweeping floors. I would like to offer you a special position with my orchestra's development program." Thomas blinked. "What kind of position, sir?" "A paid apprenticeship," Reinhardt said. "You would work with our composers and pianists, develop your natural gifts, learn the theory and technique to support what you already do instinctively. Eventually, perhaps you would perform. Your piece tonight suggests you have much to say through music." Thomas's mind raced. A paid apprenticeship. No more mopping floors, fixing leaky faucets, being invisible. Instead, making music, learning from professionals, maybe even performing on real stages. It seemed impossible. Things like this didn't happen to people from Milltown. I don't know what to say," he managed. Reinhardt smiled slightly. "Say yes, young man. Talent is too precious to waste." Thomas looked around the lobby, at the elegant surroundings, the well-dressed people, the world that had always been closed to him until tonight. Then he thought of his tiny apartment, his parents who had worked so hard to give him even the small opportunities he'd had, the electronic keyboard they had scraped to afford. "Yes," he said finally, his voice stronger now. "Thank you. I'd like that very much." The next morning felt like the first day of a new life. Thomas woke before his alarm, his mind already racing with thoughts of the meeting ahead. He showered quickly in his tiny bathroom, then stood before his closet, suddenly aware of how few nice clothes he owned. He put on the same outfit from the showcase. It was the best he had, and hoped no one would notice. His bike ride to the conservatory was the same route he'd taken hundreds of times, past the same shops and street corners, but everything looked different somehow. The morning light seemed brighter, the air fresher. Even the weight of his backpack, containing a packed lunch and a thermos of coffee, felt lighter on his shoulders. When he arrived at the conservatory, Thomas hesitated at the employee entrance out of habit, then remembered he wasn't here to clean today. Instead, he walked around to the main doors, feeling oddly like an imposter as he climbed the stone steps where he usually swept leaves. The receptionist looked up as he entered. "Can I help you?" "I'm Thomas Webb," he said, the word still strange in his mouth. "I have a meeting with Maestro Reinhardt at 10. Recognition flickered in her eyes. "Oh yes, of course. Everyone's talking about your performance last night." She checked her computer. "They're in Studio C. Do you know where that is?" Thomas nodded. He knew every room in the building, had cleaned them all countless times. As he walked down the familiar hallway, he passed a group of students who fell silent when they saw him. One of them, a pianist who had performed before him at the showcase, gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Not quite friendly, but respectful. Different from the usual invisibility. Studio C was one of the best rooms in the conservatory, with perfect acoustics and a magnificent grand piano. Thomas had always been careful when cleaning it, treating the instruments with reverence. Now, as he knocked on the door, he felt his heart pounding against his ribs. "Come in," called a voice. Thomas entered to find Maestro Reinhardt seated at a small table with two other people, a middle-aged woman with short gray hair and glasses, and a younger man with a laptop open in front of him. The grand piano stood in the center of the room, its lid raised like a great black wing. "Ah, Thomas," Reinhardt said, rising. "Right on time. Allow me to introduce Professor Winters, head of composition at the conservatory, and David Chen, who will be helping us transcribe your work." Thomas shook hands with both of them, noticing how Professor Winters studied him with curious eyes. "I must admit," she said, "I was sorry to miss your performance last night. I've heard quite remarkable things." Thomas looked down, uncomfortable with the praise. "Thank you." Reinhardt gestured to the piano. "Perhaps you could play the piece again for Professor Winters? Then we can discuss the next steps." Thomas nodded and moved to the instrument, adjusting the bench to his height. He placed his hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. The music came more easily this time, without the weight of judgment and expectation that had filled the hall last night. Thomas closed his eyes, letting the melody flow through him, aware of small changes happening as he played. New connections, slight variations that felt right in the moment. When he finished, he opened his eyes to see Professor Winters leaning forward in her chair, her expression intense. "Remarkable," she said. "No formal training at all?" Thomas shook his head. "Just what I could teach myself. And yet there are elements of classical structure, jazz harmonies, even some minimalist influences." She turned to Reinhardt. "You were right to call me." David was typing rapidly on his laptop, which Thomas now saw was connected to a small recording device. "I've captured the audio," he said. "I can begin working on the transcription right away." Reinhardt turned to Thomas. "David will create a written version of your composition. This is important for several reasons. Copyright protection, for one, but also so that others might perform it if you're willing." Thomas hadn't thought about others playing his music. The idea was both exciting and strange. "That would be fine," he said. "But I don't read music very well. I won't be able to check if it's right." "That's where I come in," Professor Winters said. "I'll work with you to ensure the transcription captures what you're playing. And if you're interested, I could help you learn to read and write music yourself." Thomas felt a surge of hope. "I'd like that very much," Reinhardt nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now about the apprenticeship I mentioned. It would begin next month and last for 1 year, with possibility of extension. You would receive a stipend of $2,000 per month. Not a fortune, but enough to live on while you study." The amount was nearly twice what Thomas made as a janitor. He tried to keep his face neutral, not wanting them to see just how life-changing that sum would be for him. "During this time," Reinhardt continued, "you would work with Professor Winters on music theory and composition. You would have access to practice rooms here at the conservatory, and you would observe rehearsals with my orchestra when we are in town." It sounded like a dream. Thomas waited for the catch, for the moment when they would realize he didn't belong in this world. "There is one more thing," Reinhardt said, his tone shifting slightly. "The spring festival is in 2 months. I would like you to perform your piece there, not just for a local audience, but for the national music community. Critics, patrons, other conductors. It would be an opportunity to introduce your talent to a wider world." Thomas felt a cold splash of fear. I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "You are," Reinhardt said firmly. "What you lack in technical training you make up for in authentic voice. That cannot be taught, and it is what audiences respond to most strongly. The technical aspects, we can work on those in the coming weeks." Professor Winters nodded agreement. "I've taught students with perfect technique who never move an audience the way you did with your playing last night. The fundamentals we can address quickly." Thomas looked between them, seeing their confidence in him, wanting to believe in it himself. "All right," he said finally. "I'll try." "Excellent," Reinhardt said, standing. "Now there are some papers to sign, details to arrange. David will continue working on the transcription. Perhaps you and Professor Winters could begin your first lesson." The next 3 hours passed in a blur. Thomas signed contract papers, filled out tax forms, and received a conservatory ID card that felt strange in his pocket. Then Professor Winters took him to a classroom with a piano and began his first real music lesson. "Let's start with the basics," she said, drawing staff lines on a whiteboard. "This is how we write what you already know how to play." Thomas watched intently as she explained notes and rests, time signatures and key signatures. Some of it he had figured out on his own over the years, but much was new. His mind struggled to connect the symbols on the board with the sounds he knew so well by ear. "Don't worry," Professor Winters said, noticing his furrowed brow. "This is like learning a new language. It takes time. But you already speak the language fluently. You just need to learn how to write it down." By early afternoon, Thomas's head was swimming with new information. As the lesson wound down, Professor Winters handed him a stack of books. "Study these in the evenings," she said. "We'll meet 3 times a week to start. Your progress will depend on how much you practice the reading and writing, not just the playing. Thomas nodded, accepting the books. Thank you. For everything. As he left the classroom, he nearly ran into the conservatory director in the hallway. Ah, Thomas, the director said, with the same warmth he had shown last night. Settling in well, I hope. I've just been in touch with HR about your situation. My situation? Your employment, of course. We'll need to process your resignation from the janitorial staff, now that you're joining us in a different capacity. Thomas hadn't thought about that, about actually leaving his job. It had been steady, reliable work for 2 years. The idea of giving it up for something as uncertain as music suddenly seemed frightening. The director must have seen his hesitation. Is there a problem? No, Thomas said quickly. It's happening very fast, the director smiled. Opportunity often does. I've arranged for you to have the rest of the week off from your duties while you transition. With pay, of course. Thank you, Thomas said, though part of him wanted to grab his mop and bucket to return to the safety of the work he knew. Outside the conservatory, the afternoon sun was warm on his face. Thomas stood on the steps, his backpack now heavy with music books, his mind full of new possibilities and new fears. He had crossed a threshold, stepped into a world he had only observed from the edges. Now he had to learn how to live in it. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his mother. How did your meeting go? Dad and I are dying to know. Thomas had called his parents last night after the showcase, trying to explain what had happened, not sure they would believe it. They had listened in stunned silence. Then his father had said gruffly, "Always knew you had something special in you, boy." Now, Thomas typed back, "It went well. Really well. I'll tell you everything tonight." He put his phone away and looked out at the city. Somewhere across the river, his old life continued. His apartment, his few possessions, his quiet routines. Ahead of him stretched something new and unknown, thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Thomas took a deep breath and started down the steps. He had a lot to learn, and not much time before the spring festival. But first he needed to go home and really let himself believe that this was happening, that the music he had kept hidden for so long would finally be heard. The 2 months leading up to the spring festival passed in a whirlwind of change for Thomas. His days, once filled with mops and cleaning solutions, were now packed with music theory, piano technique, and countless hours of practice. Professor Winters proved to be a demanding but patient teacher, pushing Thomas to learn in weeks what most students took years to master. "Your ear is remarkable," she told him during their 3rd week of lessons. "You hear relationships between notes that some of my graduate students still struggle with, but your hands need discipline." Thomas spent hours each day on technical exercises, training his fingers to move with precision and control. His hands, once calloused from manual labor, developed a different kind of strength, one built for delicacy and speed across the keys. Sometimes, after particularly long practice sessions, he would look down at his hands and barely recognize them as his own. The conservatory had given him access to a practice room with a decent upright piano. Thomas often arrived when the building opened and stayed until closing, working through the exercises Professor Winters assigned, then returning to his own composition, refining and expanding it with his new knowledge. David had completed the transcription of his piece, and seeing his music written down for the first time had been a strange experience. The notes on the page seemed both familiar and foreign, like seeing a photo of himself from an angle he couldn't normally view. "We should give it a title," Reinhardt had said during one of his visits to check on Thomas's progress. "What do you call it in your mind?" Thomas had thought for a moment. "Crossing Rivers," he finally said. "That's what it feels like to me." Reinhardt had nodded approvingly. Fitting. At home, Thomas's tiny apartment had transformed as well. Music books now shared space with his few possessions. A keyboard, not a professional model but far better than his childhood one, sat against the wall, allowing him to practice quietly in the evenings. The first thing he had bought with his apprenticeship money was a decent pair of headphones, so he could play without disturbing his neighbors. His parents visited one Sunday, making the bus trip across the river to see his new world. Thomas played for them on the conservatory's grand piano, watching his mother wipe away tears and his father sit unusually still, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Always knew you had music in you," his father said afterward. clapping him awkwardly on the shoulder. "Just never thought we'd see you up on a real stage." "I'm still getting used to it myself," Thomas had admitted. As the festival approached, Thomas found himself increasingly nervous. The event was much bigger than the showcase had been, a week-long celebration of music held at the city's main concert hall, with performers and attendees coming from across the country. Reinhardt had scheduled Thomas's performance for the festival's prestigious Saturday evening concert. "People are curious," Reinhardt told him. "Word has spread about the janitor with extraordinary talent. Use that curiosity. Make them listen." The story had indeed spread beyond the conservatory. A local newspaper had run a small feature about Thomas, interviewing both Reinhardt and the conservatory director. The piece called him a hidden gem and a natural prodigy discovered in unexpected circumstances. Reading it had made Thomas uncomfortable. He didn't feel like a prodigy, just someone who loved music and had been given an unlikely chance. 1 week before the festival, during a rehearsal at the concert hall, Thomas hit a wall. His expanded and refined composition fell apart under his fingers, passages he had played perfectly the day before suddenly becoming jumbled and wrong. After the third failed attempt, he stopped, his hands hovering above the keys. "I can't do this," he said, his voice tight. "I'm not ready." Reinhardt, who had been listening from the 5th row, walked to the stage. "What's happening, Thomas?" "It's too much," Thomas said, gesturing to the vast empty hall with its hundreds of seats. "I keep thinking about all those people, all those experts. They'll know I don't belong here." Reinhardt studied him for a moment. "Come with me," he said finally. He led Thomas backstage and down a narrow hallway to a small office. Inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with old programs, photographs, and memorabilia from past festivals. Reinhardt pulled out a framed photo and handed it to Thomas. It showed a young boy, perhaps 12 years old, standing stiffly beside a piano, his expression serious and somewhat frightened. "That was my first public performance," Reinhardt said. "Vienna, 1973. I was terrified, convinced everyone would realize I was a fraud." Thomas looked up in surprise. "You?" Reinhardt nodded. "Every musician feels this way at some point. The question is whether you let it stop you." He took the photo back, returning it to its place on the shelf. "When you played that night at the showcase, who were you playing for?" Thomas thought about it. "For myself, I guess. Once I started, I forgot anyone was listening." "That's your answer then," Reinhardt said. "Play for yourself. The audience will follow." The night of the performance arrived clear and cool. Thomas stood backstage adjusting the cuffs of his new suit, a gift from Reinhardt, who had insisted a musician needed proper performance attire. Professor Winters had helped him select it, choosing something simple but elegant that wouldn't make him feel like he was wearing a costume. Through the curtain, Thomas could hear the murmur of the audience as they filled the hall. The concert had sold out days ago, partly due to the usual festival attendance and partly, he suspected, because of curiosity about him. Rose had stopped by his practice room that afternoon to wish him luck. "I saved all year to buy a ticket to this festival," she had told him. "Never thought I'd be coming to hear our janitor play." Former janitor, Thomas had corrected with a small smile. "But I still know how to use a mop if this music thing doesn't work out." Now, as he waited for his cue, Thomas felt oddly calm. The panic of the previous week had faded, replaced by a quiet certainty. This piece was his story, the story of a boy from the wrong side of the river who found beauty in sound. If people connected with it, that was wonderful. If they didn't, the music would still be true. The stage manager touched his arm. "You're on in 2 minutes, Mr. Webb." Thomas nodded, took a deep breath, and moved to the edge of the curtain. On stage, Reinhardt was introducing him to the audience, discovered through unusual circumstances, but his talent speaks for itself. "It is my pleasure to present Thomas Webb performing his original composition, Crossing Rivers." Applause filled the hall as Thomas walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, making it difficult to see individual faces in the audience, but he could feel the weight of attention as he approached the piano. He sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. For a moment, he was back in the empty conservatory hall, playing for no one but himself. Then the music began, flowing from his fingers with a certainty that surprised him. The hours of practice, the technical exercises, the theory lessons, all of it supported but didn't overshadow the heart of what he had created. The piece had evolved over the past months. With Professor Winter's guidance, Thomas had expanded certain sections, refined others, and added depth to the harmonies. But the emotional core remained unchanged, the yearning, the struggle, the quiet joy of finding one's true voice. As he played, Thomas became aware of a perfect silence in the hall. No coughing, no rustling programs, no whispers, just the music and the collective attention of hundreds of people, listening. The final section of the piece built to a controlled intensity that Thomas hadn't been capable of before his training. His hands moved with newfound precision, bringing forth exactly the sounds he heard in his mind. As the last notes faded, Thomas kept his hands on the keys, eyes closed, letting the moment stretch. Then came the applause, not polite or curious, but genuine and enthusiastic. Thomas stood and bowed as Reinhardt had taught him, his heart pounding with exhilaration and relief. As he straightened, he saw the audience rising to their feet. A standing ovation. In the front row, he could make out his parents standing proudly. His father, who rarely showed emotion, was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. Reinhardt joined him on stage, shaking his hand with a firm grip. "Well done," he said, his voice barely audible over the continuing applause. Thomas bowed once more, then left the stage, his legs shaky with adrenaline. In the wings, Professor Winters waited with a rare smile. "Congratulations," she said. "That was exceptional." The backstage area was soon crowded with well-wishers, music critics, fellow musicians, festival organizers. Thomas shook hands and accepted congratulations in a daze, still processing what had just happened. A representative from a recording company handed him a business card. "We'd be interested in discussing your future work," the man said. "Call me next week." Thomas nodded, slipping the card into his pocket alongside two others he'd already received. His future, something that had once seemed so limited and defined, now opened before him with possibilities he was still learning to imagine. Later that night, after the crowds had dispersed and the concert hall emptied, Thomas returned to the stage. The cleaning staff was at work in the aisles, but they nodded to him with respect as he walked to the piano. He sat down on the bench, not to play, but simply to be in this space one last time before the festival moved on to the next day's performances. His fingers traced the keys lightly without pressing them. One of the cleaners approached the stage, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "Beautiful music tonight," she said. "Never heard anything like it." "Thank you," Thomas replied, seeing in her the life he might have continued living if not for a chance encounter, a moment of courage. "You're him, aren't you?" she asked. "The one who used to be a janitor? I read about you in the paper." Thomas nodded. "That's me," she smiled. "Good for you. Shows you never know what might happen." As she moved away to continue her work, Thomas looked out at the empty hall, thinking of rivers crossed and bridges built. The woman was right, you never knew what might happen. Sometimes people laughed when you sat down at the piano, and sometimes, if you found the courage to play anyway, the music changed everything.